treasure, the Sassanid king was feeling pretty good about himself, and likely thinking that the next time he marched west, he might just make a play at staying permanently. Which brings us to Lucius Septimius Odenathus and the city of Palmyra. Palmyra was an oasis town located in the deserts between Persia and Syria, and it served as a key link in the east-west trade routes, acting as the last way station on the northern leg of the Silk Road. Not only did the city's isolated location allow it to grow wealthy from the duties and taxes levied on traders who had no other option but to pass through Palmyra, but it also allowed them to run a protection racket, supplying local muscle to help ward off desert thieves who might set upon an unprotected caravan. That there was something of a revolving door between the desert thieves and the local muscle is, of course, neither here nor there. Palmyra's location out in the middle of the desert also allowed it something that most cities in the ancient world had long since lost: independence. The age of the city-state had long ago given way to the age of the multinational empire. But Palmyra lay out in a nebulous gray area between Rome to the west and Persia to the east. As such, it was often claimed by both, but controlled by neither. As Parthian power had waned, though, Palmyra had more and more come into the Roman sphere, and many of its leading citizens had also been made Roman citizens. Emperors understood the economic importance of the oasis city, and wanted to make sure that the rulers of Palmyra were given every privilege and perk of status enjoyed by the leading men of Rome. As his name suggests, the family of Lucius Septimius Odenathus had been granted citizenship by Septimius Severus around the turn of the 3rd century, and though they were not technically Roman senators, they were recognized as being of senatorial rank in the economic sense of the term, if not in the strictly political sense. By the 250s, Odenathus was the leading man of Palmyra and acting as the city's chief executive. He had close ties to Rome, but the growing power of the Sassanids had left him and his city in a precarious position. The Romans were content to let Palmyra enjoy its nominal independence as long as the trade routes continued to function and the taxes on Roman merchants didn't get out of hand. But Shapur seemed an altogether more ambitious sort. Odenathus had been worried for some time that the Sassanids would attempt to take over direct control of Palmyra, and with the Romans being dealt several defeats in a row at the hands of the Persians, his anxiety had to have grown immeasurably by the time Valerian was captured in 260. Some sources claim Odenathus made overtures to Shapur, attempting to forge an eastern-looking alliance, but that the Sassanid king had rejected the notion of a treaty, clearly indicating that a takeover of Palmyra was coming down the chute. But others reject the notion that Odenathus made any attempt to bargain with the Sassanids, and that from the get-go, he believed that the fortunes of his city were best served when they were tied to the fortunes of Rome. Whatever the underlying reasons, when Shapur made his way back to the east in 260 laden with treasure, he was met by an army raised and led by the Palmyrene prince. The result of the meeting was a complete rout of the unprepared Sassanid army. Shapur thought himself 1,000 miles from anything resembling a real threat, and was as surprised as his men to find himself suddenly fleeing back to Ctesiphon after being smacked around by some cobbled-together army led by an obscure Palmyrene. By putting Shapur to flight, though, obscure Odenathus vanished forever, replaced in the minds of East and West alike by legendary Odenathus. Legendary Odenathus went on to become one of the most unique figures in Roman history. His capital was Palmyra, technically beyond the Roman frontier, and though he held Roman citizenship, he was still considered by most Romans to be a barbarian. A smart barbarian and a cultured barbarian, but a barbarian nonetheless. There is always something to be said for promoting men of merit wherever you can find them, and anytime the Romans faced a dire crisis, they always did well when they laid down their traditional class biases to elevate the most capable man to lead them out of the danger, whoever he might be and wherever he might come from. But the rank, power, and status gained by Odenathus was something altogether different. After defeating the Sassanids, this foreigner essentially leased the eastern provinces from its Roman owners. He never held the title, but he lived in the house and he called the shots, all with Gallienus' technical blessing. Were he not viewed as the only thing standing between the Romans and a complete Sassanid takeover, nothing even remotely close to this arrangement would have been possible, and Odenathus probably would have been executed for even suggesting it. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and in these desperate times, the Romans gave themselves over to a Palmyrene prince who promised to keep. As the West was giving itself over to Postumus, and the East was giving itself over to Odenathus, there was one other trouble spot that Gallienus faced after his defeat of the Alemanni in 260 AD. Back on the northern frontier, the troops that had been left behind after Gallienus headed to Italy following his suppression of Ingenuus were dealing with a host of German tribes, ready, willing, and able to overrun the Danube. As was the case with the Rhine legions, the Danube troops resented the emperor for dashing off after deeming their problems not sufficiently dire enough to remain in country with them. Again, their resentment may not have been rational. The emperor was, after all, going to defend Italy, the home province, the invasion of which probably was the most dire threat facing the empire at that particular moment. But that didn't stop them from taking the emperor's absence personally, and as they steeled themselves to fend off the Germans, they elevated one of their generals, a man named Regalianus, to the rank of emperor. As with Postumus, the elevation was not taken by Regalianus as his cue to march on Rome and establish his authority over the capital. Instead, he took it as his cue to lead a vigorous defense of the Danube provinces, which he now considered his personal responsibility. So, there were now at least 3 men, Gallienus, Postumus, and Regalianus, each claiming the title Imperator, and it is possible that they were already joined by 2 more, the sons of Macrianus in the east. It is hard to tell when, in this mishmash of events, Quietus and Macrianus the Younger were elevated to the rank of co-Augusti by the eastern legions at the behest of their father, but it probably came not long after Odenathus' victory over Shapur. It is not hyperbole to state that at this moment, the empire's executive leadership had never been as fractured, as local citizens and soldiers alike each looked to local commanders to see them through these dangerous times. In Italy, Gallienus still considered himself the ultimate master of the whole empire, and while his rivals focused on defending the borders, Gallienus focused on how to win back all that had so suddenly been stolen from him. Though the East and West would remain outside of his jurisdiction for the rest of his life, the Danube provinces were quickly brought back into the fold, as Regalianus was killed shortly after his elevation, battling a tribe of invading Germans. Gallienus immediately marched up from Italy to restore his mastery over the legion, and with the emperor on hand once again, the legions quickly fell back into line. One of the biggest problems facing Gallienus at this point was that events were unfolding so fast, and invasions occurring over such a wide area, that it was difficult to deploy legionary forces in a timely manner. For all his rushing about, Gallienus always seemed to be arriving too late to nip problems in the bud, and seemed to forever be showing up just in time to close the barn door after the horses had run off. This inability to efficiently reinforce hotspots was not just increasing the amount of devastation being wrought on the provinces, but, as we've just seen, it was also leading to an exponential increase in the number of usurpers challenging his rule. But if the provincial legions could be convinced that the emperor would be able to quickly provide help when they were attacked, Gallienus figured they would be less prone to supporting rivals. Right now, though, the legionary apparatus was too cumbersome to move quickly from one zone to another, So Gallienus hit upon an idea that, though it would not become official Roman policy for another generation, it would one day become a staple of Roman defenses in the 4th century: the mobile cavalry. Up until this point, cavalry units were attached to infantry legions, and they would all move around and fight together. But as quickly as the Roman legions could move, a couple of thousand foot soldiers are never going to be able to move as fast as a couple of thousand horsemen. What Gallienus did was collect all the various cavalry detachments and mass them together into a single force that would be run by a single commander and be answerable directly to the emperor. From this point on, wherever there was trouble, the emperor would order his mass cavalry unit to the scene, and in many cases, their mere presence would be enough to deter invaders. And not only did this cavalry serve as an excellent deterrent, it also served as a good psychological connection between the far-flung provincial legions and their emperor. They no longer felt they were being left to fend for themselves out on the frontier. Maybe the mobile cavalry wasn't based in their territory, but when they needed help, help was on the way. Gallienus strategically based this new force in the city of Milan, where they could keep an eye not just on Postumus, whose long-term ambitions were at this point unknown, but also on any Germans thinking about crossing through the Alps into Italy. They were also near enough the Danube frontier that if the Goths got itchy feet, and they would over the next decade, the mobile cavalry could spring into action and be on the scene in no time. It was an idea born of the particular circumstances Gallienus was facing at the time, with domestic revolts and foreign invasions cropping up all around him. But in time, the wisdom of a permanent mobile defense force would become obvious. Times had changed. Simply posting legionary garrisons along the frontier was no longer sufficient to ward off foreign threats to the empire. There are many reasons why Gallienus' reign is seen as a period of transition, and the mobile cavalry is just one obvious example. Next week, we'll get into a few more examples. In particular, Gallienus' relationship with the Senate and the growing divide between a political career and a military career would lead to the armed forces finally becoming a completely separate branch of the state. Rome had always intermingled its, and indeed, the most important function of the consul had, once upon a time, been to act as the commander-in-chief of the army. The days of combining military and civilian careers, though, was about to end, as the professionalization of the army, long established among the rank and file, was now finally reaching to the top of the chain of command. Henceforth, generals would now be generals, and politicians would be politicians, and only in the person of the emperor would they ever meet again. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 114, The Nadir of Our Fortunes. Last time, we left Rome in a state of